to get started because we have many panelists, many issues, and little time. I think you all have bios of them, so I won't bother to read that, but obviously Ayaan is on my far right, Darin to my right, Ahmed to my left, and Will McCants on the far left. There are so many issues, from economic deterioration, political instability, human rights, etc. I thought we would just try to lay a foundation by asking Darin to first state, what are American interests in the Middle East? Why shouldn't we do what some on the far left and the far right say, just leave them alone, let them work it out, and we'll be safer huddling in America and staying out of the Middle East? So what's the cost of that? Why shouldn't we do that?
Well, thank you very much, Karen. As we all, I think, understand from having seen the historic transformation in the region of the past 2 years, the uprisings of the Arab Spring have really presented the people of the Middle East and North Africa region with an opportunity to confront some of the long-standing challenges that have remained. And not long after these transformations began, President Obama very clearly stated in remarks at the State Department in May 2011 that it will now be United States policy to support democratic reform and these democratic transitions in the region. Now, this policy recognizes that the United States' core interests in the region remain the same. Those core interests are combating terrorism, supporting Arab-Israeli peace, energy security, and protecting basic human values and human rights. We also maintain an interest in ensuring the free flow of commerce in the region, as well as navigable waterways, something that is very important to the US. So those core interests remain the same, and those core interests are not going to change.
Ayaan, I'd like to ask you to address, in a sense, the same question, because I know you have a strong view on culture, if you will. Why shouldn't America, and does our culture allow us to take it's a killing field, let it stay until they can resolve it themselves?
Yeah. Well, as you said, the American core interests, you can divide them into, say, material and moral. Material, energy security, material, navigable waters. I find it often so much easier to talk about these material interests than the moral interests. If I compare the United States to Europe, I find, and I was there for the last 14 years and served in the Dutch Parliament, that when it comes to moral issues, the sort of default position that Europe takes is, let's leave them alone. We can use soft power to influence and persuade, but hard power is out of the question given who Europeans are and the European historical relationship with the region. In the United States, I think what makes America America is an idea. And so the moral core interests that you mentioned about humanity and equality and ensuring that lives are not lost, it seems as if Americans feel that burden more hugely than the Europeans do. On the other hand, what I also see is it's a benign naivety. I mean, naivety is always benign. But there's just this great naivety that is based on assumptions. Okay, there was an uprising in the Middle East. What was it about in 2011, 2012? People were asking, demanding economic opportunity. This is something we understand as Americans, economic opportunity. People were demanding political freedoms. This is something we understand. In the United States, we demanded, that's all our history. So we are naturally allied with masses and masses and masses of human beings, even though they're different from us, who demand economic opportunity and political freedom. But what in the United States we fail to see are the cultural differences.
I mean, we think everyone is like us.
We think everyone is like us. We also think that culture is subordinate to, say, economic opportunity or political freedoms. We forget that religion is an outcome of culture, that political freedoms are an outcome of culture, that economic opportunity is an outcome of culture. So if we really want to understand the region, we have to delve into the differences between us in culture, and particularly the importance that the region and the region's peoples, even though they're out on the streets demanding political freedoms, the culture and the religion that they adhere to. The Pew report on religion, politics, and society was just published yesterday, and large percentages in some countries, 70%, in some countries 80%, some countries 90% in that region would like to be governed under Sharia law. Now, Sharia law could not be more different from the United Nations Constitution. And these are differences that we have to see, I would say, before we make policy. Otherwise, we make policy and then it becomes ad hoc, go on the day.
Mm-hmm. These are terrific points, but just to move on to someone who also looks at democracy. Egypt has clearly come the closest. You did actually have a free election. What's the future of democracy in Egypt, or will it get sidetracked by just the cultural issues that Ayaan is talking about?
Thank you, Karen, for that. First of all, our background, or what happened in Egypt before the revolution. We are suffering more than 30 years from torture, from corruption, from many bad things, many bad governance. So our generation want to change these issues, want to change this behavior. So from 2004, we, as a new generation, as politicians, political figures, began to criticize and resist against dictatorship, and we succeeded to step down Mubarak. But the problem is, step down Mubarak is not step down the regime. So we suffer till now from the old regime, from the military council, because they hijacking the authority after Mubarak, and they prevented any development in Egypt, any achieve our demands for revolution. We, in 25th of January 2011, we go to the streets protesting for freedom and dignity and social justice. This is the main reasons make us want the revolution, want to change. Mm-hmm. We want to change Egypt to have civil state, to have...
But you're saying nothing has really happened except Morsi has replaced Mubarak?
No, not exactly. But we have, yes, more freedom now. Not that we want to have, but we have better than before the revolution, a little better. But we want real freedom of expression, real freedom of beliefs. Till now, the dignity, the social justice, we didn't achieve that. Freedom or democracy, in our perspective, is not just elections. We need a real principles of democracy and freedom and social justice.
Well, I want to talk to you about Syria, but first I want to ask, is Islam incompatible with liberal government?
No, it's not incompatible, but some versions of Islam are quite incompatible with liberal government. The kind of Islam I focus on is called Salafism, which is sort of a shorthand way you could think of it is a puritanical movement within Islam that began in the early 20th century. Salafis for a long time wanted to stay out of democratic government. They didn't believe in participating in parliaments. They believed that this was against God's law, that God had in fact provided laws to humans, and humans' job was to only implement those laws. We've seen a big shift over the last few decades within the certain segments of the Salafi movement who have come to embrace democratic principles. And this goes completely against their ideology, and they are doing it for very pragmatic reasons, and you could say for cynical reasons even, but it just goes to show that even a group whose ideology says, you should have no participation in democratic processes, when given a chance, they will get involved. And it's not completely a negative story.
But do they believe it, or is it a means to an end to get themselves in power?
Oh, it's a means for many of them, to be sure, but because their ideology is so extreme in most countries, like in Egypt, they'll never be a majority. They're not a big tent Islamist party. They appeal to a very narrow section of society. And when they are in parliament, they push for things like far more conservative legislation on women, minorities, so on and so forth. On the other hand, in order to get their agenda done, they also have to reach across the aisle and work with secularists, with liberals. For example, the second largest political party in Egypt, the Noor Party, which is a very Salafi party, has worked a lot with the National Salvation Front, which are the liberals and the secularists, in contesting Morsi's grab for power. So I think in some ways they can be quite good for democracy, although their long-term vision is quite anti-democratic.
I am really interested in getting everyone to focus on what we see over the next 10, 20 years in the Middle East. And I tend to be optimistic, but I must say not about this part of the world. I mean, I think it's a killing field now. 70,000 people in Syria in a very brief time, and it's going to become an even bigger killing field over the next 10, 20 years. What can reverse any of that? Will the governments themselves, the people themselves, finally come to some modus vivendi with each other, or what ends the killing?
Sure. Certainly the crisis in Syria is one of historic proportions. UN projections are 70,000 have been killed, 1.3 million registered refugees outside of Syria, and 3.5 to 4 million people displaced in the country. This is certainly an issue that the United States is closely watching. The president has been very vocal in his support of the Syrian opposition. We have recognized the Syrian opposition as the legitimate representative of the Syrian people, and we've provided over $500 million in humanitarian assistance to Syria, as well as various forms of non-lethal support. I think it's important, though, to realize that what is occurring within Syria is not the only model for transformation that we've seen in the region. We've seen, in the case of Egypt and Tunisia, two uprisings and protest movements that led to peaceful transitions in government. We also saw a similar situation occur in Yemen with the political transition there. So we see that there are models for transformation and for democratic transition that respect the aspirations of the people in the region. And I think that those governments that respond to the economic aspirations, the democratic aspirations of the people in their region will be those that will have the easiest path towards reform. Nonetheless, those governments...
The trend seems to be, let's hunker down. I mean, Saudi Arabia, which is the country I've focused most on, I mean, they take a tiny step forward, 30 women in their Potemkin parliament, and then the old line of the caliph who survived, the Umayyad caliph who said, I hold a hair between myself and my people. When they pull, I yield. When they yield, I pull. That seems to be the way Saudi Arabia operates, inch at a time. And Syria appears to be like the Titanic going down. There's going to be a giant sucking of Jordan and Lebanon and others into it. I'm sorry, I'm being pessimistic, but what's the...
No, I can't help.
Can you arrest that scenario?
No, you asked me to say a few things about Syria, and I started making a list of things going wrong, and I've run out of room on my piece of paper.
Well, give us your executive summary there.
Yeah, it's not a good news story. I mean, the longer that this conflict goes on, the more that sectarianism increases, the more that extremists get a foothold, the more training they have, the more networks that they have. The rebels have been unable to unite, which is the main reason why the conflict goes on. They've been unable to unite, and they don't have the heavy weaponry. And actually, those two things go together. The fact that there's no central organization that's been receiving the heavy weaponry that is then able to give it to groups that are more moderate than, say, the Al-Qaeda types or other Salafi militants has kept the rebels fractured. And there is a lot of private money that's flowing in from the Gulf to arm the Salafi groups that's preventing them. They have no incentive to ally themselves with the Free Syrian Army. So the rebels are fractured. Iran is playing a long game. They are trying to shore up the Assad regime, but I think Iran realizes that they're never going to be able to quite put the country back together again. But all Iran needs is access to the ports and to keep the corridor open in Lebanon to keep weapons flowing into Hezbollah. And you saw Nasrallah yesterday announce that Hezbollah was ready to get into the fight. Well, they're already in the fight. Iran has already sent its own Quds force, their special forces, into Syria. You have this huge refugee problem now in Turkey and in Jordan. Lebanon is becoming destabilized. The economy, of course, is completely wrecked, and a lot of these young men who are fighting for Assad or for the rebels, a lot of them are doing it just to have some source of income. And then on top of all of that, you have this chemical weapons issue, which is making the United States and its Western allies and its regional allies incredibly nervous.
So what should we do, given that litany of...
Yeah, I think there are some things the United States could do. It should have done them earlier, and I understand why the U.S. was reluctant to get involved coming off of 2 wars in the region. With an economic downturn, there is no appetite in the United States for a full-scale invasion, and I think that would be extremely counterproductive. A no-fly zone across the whole country would be very difficult to do. Syria has excellent air defenses, so this would take several weeks for the United States to do it. We'd likely have some of our own people shot down. That would be a difficult political risk. We could establish a smaller no-fly zone up in the north. That may be what we end up doing. In the meantime, the best thing the United States can do is start to allow some of these heavy weapons to go to the Supreme Military Council. That will give it much more bargaining power with the other rebels. It will help pull these different rebel groups together. The United States has been leaning on its allies, particularly Saudi Arabia and Qatar, to keep these weapons away from the rebels. I think those floodgates have opened in the past few weeks. I think the United States itself is going to start providing these weapons. The other part of it is to start leaning on countries like Kuwait and Bahrain to make sure that their private citizens are not arming the really nasty parts of the rebels, these Salafi militant groups, in particular the Al-Qaeda organization Nusra.
And Ahmed, looking at your country, is there something more you think the U.S., and you can speak to Europe too, but the U.S. should be doing, or should we let you all handle the issues yourselves?
I think there is many things maybe will helpful for Egypt from the US. For example, investment. For example, supporting civil society or NGOs. But what we find now, just supporting the authority, supporting Morsi, like what happened before, they supported SCAF, the Military Council, against the revolution. And before the revolution, US administration supported Mubarak against the opposition, or not against, but is supporting work and defending about Mubarak. They're supporting anyone in the authority. We don't need tear gas from US. We need investment or supporting NGOs and civil society, not tear gas. But we found now there's a lot of millions dollars to give tear gas to the government now in Egypt. So I think if US really want to support democracy, there's many issues they can deal with, not supporting the authority.
Ayaan, I would be interested in you on the same issues. Ayaan just became an American, so we can address you as an American, and you can advise your government here on what we ought to do in either in the whole region, but Syria, Egypt, you know, from your vantage point, what should we do?
Well, I think what we need to do is understand the historic three pillars of power structure in the region. The oldest is the bloodline. I call it the bloodline, but you talk to various experts and they'll call it the tribe or the clan or the sect or whatever, but it's a power based on blood relations and an intricate network of marriages and trade, etc. Then you have the despot. Now, the despot can be a king, but he can be a military man or not. He can be the son of, you know, Bashar al-Assad is the son of his father, Hussein. And then you have the clergy. And I think the clergymen themselves today are divided, they're split into the established clergymen whose main goal is to preserve its own power, and they issue fatwas when necessary for the other two groups, particularly for the despots. And then you have the clergymen.
Issue fatwas to support the despot.
To support, yeah. So if Saudi Arabia wants a fatwa from the Grand Mufti of Saudi Arabia to do something about the Iranian threat, the Mufti will murmur something about not wanting to be involved in politics, but he will issue a fatwa. And so you have that subsection of the clergymen.
Excuse me one second. This is one of the things that angered the Saudi Salafis so much,
Yes.
was that the King Fahd, when he wanted to welcome American troops in 1990, went to the religious and got a fatwa that said, yes, it's okay to bring, in their mind, infidels into the land of the two holy places, and they haven't forgotten it yet. They see the religious establishment as doing the will of the king, not the will of Allah.
Of the people, yeah. So as being corrupted and co-opted and compromised. And then you have the students of that religious establishment who are now in mutiny against them themselves. And, you know, in the West, they get all kinds of labels, Salafis, the Muslim Brotherhood, call them whatever you like. But that is a movement that is very interesting, very modern, and it is the most influential among the people. It's a grassroots movement. They've convinced the masses that the only way out of the misery that the region is in is to go back and understand Islam, establish Sharia law, etc., etc.
So now, if you take, it is against everything. The despots, the Westerners.
Yes, and they use modern means. They use modern technology of communication. They use modern means of transport, modern means of organizing to mobilize the masses and to establish power. Now, within that, and I think you talked about it, within that group of, let me say, neo-religious establishment, there's also a division between the revolutionaries, the ones who want to agitate and want power and jihad now, and the ones who have come to understand to take the long path. So I see the Muslim Brotherhood, who now rule Egypt, as the group who have understood that if you really want to play the game and get to power, then you play by the rules of the game until you're in a position to change the rules of the game. And then the opposition, the Salafists who want revolution right now. Now, if you take these historic three power structures and you look at the opposition that is westernized, that is in many ways, it's liberal, it's social democratic, it's Marxist, it's feminist, they're interested in human rights, etc. They're very broad, they appeal to what many of us in the West believe and want, but they're not united. There's no cohesion and there's no cohesive ideology which can compete with that of the Muslim Brotherhood. The despots are tumbling. The religious establishment very cleverly knows exactly. I mean, look at the genesis of the University of Al-Azhar and how they shift in their support, and it's very sophisticated, I must say, a little bit more sophisticated than the White House right now, in shifting allegiances from one to the other. If you understand that process, then
Al-Azhar is the main religious university in Egypt.
If you understand these three power pillars, how they conserve their power, how that all plays together, then I think it's very, first and foremost, we must understand what that is and how that game is played. And then before we intervene, say, these are our core interests and we're going to support, and then there has to be a timeline. Those people and organizations that are closest to us, and I think that's what we did in Eastern Europe. I think that is why, Ahmed, you are here. The 6th May movement may be an umbrella organization for people with varying worldviews, but at least those worldviews are closer to our worldview than that of the Muslim Brotherhood, that of the Salafis, that of the despots, or that of the religious establishment. Let me say the reactionary religious establishment. Once we understand that, then we can use both soft power and hard power more effectively and more smartly than we do now, and we're not doing that now. Now, when it comes to optimism versus pessimism, I'm pessimistic on the short term. On the short term, these power structures are going to fight within one another and amongst one another, and I think what we are seeing, if we're really honest with ourselves, is that the Muslim Brotherhood, the Islamists, whether it's the jihadi arm or now the political process following arm, I don't want to call them Democrats, that is where the mass is. Mass loyalty now goes to Sharia law. Mass loyalty right now is with the Muslim Brotherhood. That's going to change. You see that kind of change taking place in Egypt. You see signs of it in Tunisia. You see it in other places. It's going to change, and that's where my optimism lies.
Does the rest of you agree with her that that's going to change when 80% of the people favor Sharia?
I'm saying 80% now may want Sharia, but if you read that Pew report closely, the places where Sharia law has actually been implemented, that is where the people are the most negative about Sharia, and the attitudes are negative to Sharia law. Now that can take, in the case of Iran, what are we, it's almost 40 years, 30 years plus, in places where, I mean, like Turkey, the Turkish people can romanticize about the ideal society ruled under Sharia law, but they really haven't had a taste of what Sharia law is like. So my optimism lies in once people go through the experience, they will reject it. But then, and that's the big question, what next? And as you've seen in 2009 with the Green Movement in Iran, they revolted against Sharia law and against their regime, but they still have not put on the table a cohesive idea on what then.
Just to follow up on a few comments that have been made, I think one thing that is very important for all of us to remember is that these transitions in the region ultimately are going to be homegrown and driven by the people of the region. They will differ country by country depending upon the specific circumstances. And in terms of United States policymakers and US policy, as we move forward, we can support our core interests, support our commitment to democratic and economic reform, but we must also keep in mind that we cannot control ultimately the outcome of these transitions. We can do our best to provide support that reflects our values, provide rule of law support, provide support to human rights reform, provide security sector reform support, all the things that we are doing in the countries in which we have assistance programs. We haven't yet discussed, to a large degree, the youth bulge that's occurring in the region, and the fact that across the region, over 50% of the population are youth, and many of them are unemployed, historic unemployment levels. And these economic trends, or that economic trend will continue, and will continue to put pressure on those governments that have not taken those steps to provide jobs and to provide the necessary economic reform to meet the needs of the people. And so when this question of, a question that often comes up is, does the US support new governments, these Islamist governments or secular governments? I think it's important to keep in mind that what the United States supports is we support governments that respect human rights, respect fairness and values, and that are committed to the democratic and economic aspirations of their people. And so we're not picking winners or picking sides, but we are remaining committed to our core values and shaping our assistance policy in a manner that supports those values.
I don't want to pick on you, Darin, but I think Saudi Arabia is an example of where people do not see us as supporting our values, our human rights values. For instance, when we don't say anything about people who are sentenced to prison for 10 years for simply objecting to other people being held without charges or trial. Darin made the point that the people in the region will have to decide, but Egyptians, in my experience, do have a sense of what they want, but a lot of the countries, and certainly again Saudi Arabia, people are they're not used to deciding what they want precisely for the cultural reasons that Ayaan laid out. You're a part of a tribe, or you're under a despot, or you're under the clergy, and you don't ever think for yourself. You do what you're told to do. So in a situation where people are not particularly, don't have much of a culture or history of deciding what they want, how do you keep the strong men from deciding on their behalf? I mean, our young Egyptians, you've talked about this, and Saudi Arabia, 60% of the people are under 20 years of age. It's a hugely young population, but do the young in your country really have a concept of what they want, whether it's Islam or secular democracy or...
Okay, for us, maybe we are not a political party or a political alternative or political machine like Muslim Brotherhood or the NDP party, Mubarak party, but we are the main cause or reasons for the spark of the revolution. Mm-hmm. And now we will not stop. There is many troubles, there is many obstacles already in Egypt, but the new generation will not stop. We are maybe intersected the major movement, but we have also...
So you don't think young people can be intimidated through...
We can keep forward to achieve our demons, maybe after a few years, maybe after more years in Egypt and all the Arabic region. For example, that's the reason make me optimistic that Muslim Brotherhood, yes, and they are in the power, but Morsi won the election with 51%, not with Muslim Brotherhood voices. They won the election with Muslim Brotherhood and unfortunately April-6 voices and Revolutionary Socialists and many secular groups supported Morsi against the candidate from the old regime, Shafi. So they are not won with the Islamist voices. No, now the people in the street know they tried what happened with Muslim Brotherhood. They know what is the governance of how the ruling of Muslim Brotherhood. The people, they saw now that the troubles, the Muslim Brotherhood can't govern Egypt very well, can't solve the problem. So now the majority of Egyptians now against Muslim Brotherhood, but they wait alternative. So We are in KG1 in democracy, and step by step, we will take a time, we will learn, we will have obstacles, try and error, but I am optimistic that in the future we'll be fine.
Do you have views on what difference it makes that the population is so young? What will their impact be on the region?
Well, I mean, first of all, I don't think we went through any of the slides, but there's a great series of slides just showing the economic problems that the region is facing. I think that underpins this whole discussion. I mean,
Is somebody able to put those up, because they are interesting?
Yeah, they're just a bunch of trend lines going like this. And I think, we haven't really talked about it, but a lot of these discussions are difficult to have. We're kind of talking about, how do we rehab the patient, get them back to work, when the conversation we really should be having is how do we make sure this patient lives? I mean, the fact that the Muslim Brotherhood is having all of these difficulties, and part of the reason for it is that they're just trying to amass enough power to deal with the economic issues that they're confronting. There are other reasons for it, to be sure, but a big part of their challenge is just trying to feed people. And if they reduce these subsidies for bread, for fuel that the IMF is demanding in order to get their loan, it's going to touch off large-scale riots. So they're having to balance all these things. In Tunisia, something like 17% unemployment. Remember, the Arab Spring was touched off by a cigarette vendor lighting himself on fire. There's a major economic component to this that complicates the discussion of Islamism and its role in politics. If I could go back to what Ayaan and Darin were talking about just briefly, I think it's important, particularly at this transition stage, that Islamism be allowed to collapse under its own weight. And I share Ayaan's concern to support more secular, liberal voices in the region, but I am worried that about the United States taking up that role, because particularly in this region, the things that the United States touches can turn to dust, and I worry that it will discredit the efforts of the secularists and the liberals if the U.S. gets too much involved, and particularly in bolstering them against the Brotherhood. Islamism has thrived on being an opposition ideology, and I think it's important that it either succeed or fail under its own weight, or through the efforts of a popular movement, not necessarily by the efforts of the United States, at least not directly perceived.
You're saying if we start to support them, or if we start to oppose them?
I'm saying if we throw our weight solidly behind the disorganized forces of the liberals and secularists in the Arab world, start trying to help them win elections, I'm saying that could really backfire, because the Islamists will really feed on that. We'll see that as the foreign hand working in the region. And I mean, remember, it was also a number of liberals and secularists in Egypt who were protesting against the United States because of its years of assistance to the Mubarak regime. So our name is not gold. And I mean, I'm sure Ahmed has more concrete thoughts about how the U.S. could play a constructive role without discrediting the liberals and the secularists in Egypt.
Yeah, how do you do that? Because if I agree with you that it's hazardous to your health to be embraced by the Americans, because our reputation in the region, people like Americans, but they don't like the American government in the region. So how can we embrace you helpfully?
Okay, for example, when Mubarak regime started to fought against the upper sex movement with rumors, they used upper sex, have relation with US, and there is a guys from upper sex movement travel to Serbia to get training to destroy Egypt. That is the same rumors used by the SCAF, the military council, against upper sex movement and revolution. And it's the same rumors now used by Muslim Brotherhood against upper sex and the youth movement. So they're using this cooperation between NGOs or activists. Here I have a good relation with activists here in US, Occupy movement, or researchers or students here, but they use these rumors to attack any secular or liberal or youth movement. So it's of course it's not useful to have directly supporting. but at least don't support someone against democracy. Don't support Egypt with tear gas. We don't need tear gas. We really, if every time just in American aids to Egypt, it's weapons and tear gas and supporting the regime and supporting Muslim Brotherhood. If you want to support Egypt, there is many Egypt, not secular or liberals. No, make condition about aids, about democracy, development in democracy. It's a solution. Supporting investment, supporting civil society, supporting awareness, supporting projects. It's a good support, but at least also don't support another dictatorship like what happened with Mubarak.
And that is exactly what is happening. And I really want to say I fundamentally disagree with William's statements about the intentions of the Muslim Brotherhood. We now see, and you've absolutely, given in to the fact that the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt, let's just take the case of Egypt, now that they have come to power through elections, they're taking actions to consolidate that power and to concentrate it. They're cleansing the judiciary as we speak. They, behind the scenes, are also cleansing the military so that it's loyal to the Muslim Brotherhood. They're exploring possibilities of creating nuclear weapons. To assume that all this concentration of power is geared toward meeting the economic challenges, that is what I meant by naivety. That's what I meant by benign naivety. And if that is the assumption of the United States and the American administration or European administration, then we are going to fail, whether we get involved or not. We are once again going to fail the people of the Middle East, the people of Egypt. The observation that the Islamists will say, or the American hand, hey, they're going to say that. They've been saying that since the Muslim Brotherhood was established. 200 years ago, radical Muslims were blaming outsiders. 200 years from now, they'll continue to do that. So the assumption that the current Egyptian regime is concentrating and consolidating its power to meet economic challenges is fundamentally wrong. It is absolutely wrong. They're doing it so that they can enforce and implement their program. We have seen that in Iran. We've also seen where that leads to. Now, am I saying the United States should throw its full weight against the opposition that is fragmented? I'm not saying that. I've been educated in political science, and I understand foreign relations, and I understand that as the United States, we have core interests, and we have to pursue our core interests. But if part of that core interest, besides being material, energy, navigable waters, if it's also moral, then we need to put, yes, our weight behind the people who have brought about this revolution, who opposed the despots. If we don't, we're only creating a scene where the former despot who spoke our language and looked like us is going to be replaced by a despot we really, truly don't understand.
Go ahead.
Yeah, I'd like to jump in because I think both Ahmed and Ayaan have made some excellent points about the importance of U.S. assistance being used in a manner that does support our core values of supporting human rights, democratic transitions. I think one important point, though, does need to be made. Ahmed referred to the military assistance that has been provided by the United States to the Egyptian government. And there's no doubt that we do have a military assistance relationship that has existed for 30 years because our relationship with Egypt has helped to sustain stability in the region, particularly following Egypt's entry into a peace agreement with Israel. So there's no doubt that that relationship will continue and does have a stabilizing effect in the region. Nonetheless, I think that it's important to note that the United States has a significant history of providing core foreign assistance and aid to the Egyptian people. A lot of programs that are not widely known, but that have existed for a number of years: nutrition programs, health programs, agricultural programs, educational programs. And even more recently, following the the fall of the Mubarak regime, we were actively involved in supporting civil society with ensuring that the new democratic elections occurred in a manner in which people were educated about how do you run a campaign, how's a political party stood up. And in fact, the role of U.S. assistance there, became the foil that Ayaan and Ahmed referred to. And in fact, unfortunately, some of the civil society organizations that we did support, some people may know, were put on trial in the NGO trials, and we're still waiting to hear the results of those trials in June. And so there's a balance that I think needs to be recognized, that U.S. assistance, while not necessarily as high profile or as recognized as the military assistance, the economic assistance has been there. And there has been a commitment made by our president to support the Egyptian people with $1 billion in economic assistance. And we're working very closely with the Egyptian government and with our Congress to come up with an assistance package that addresses these economic challenges, focused on confronting these problems of economic employment, along with all the other areas that I mentioned.
I must say, I think what the Middle East people understand, again, well laid out culturally by Ayaan, is power. And if we're not prepared to exercise a good deal of it, I don't think we're going to get much of a influential hearing. But I will give you a chance to either defend yourself against naivete or to address my my view that maybe I'm naive, that if we're not prepared to exercise a good bit of power, that the kind of soft whispering to despots or would-be despots won't bring much.
Yeah, I don't know a lot of revolutions where the revolutionaries that came into power left the previous regime elements alone. It's usually the case that there's some sort of purge. Thankfully, we haven't had a lot of show trials in this regard. It's not unusual for new regimes to try and consolidate their power. It's not unusual for regimes to try and get the military under control, because that can be a major source of coups. It wouldn't be unusual in this case to try and cleanse the judiciary of Mubarak era appointments, who the Morsi regime deems to be hostile. I don't see these things as indicative of Islamist behavior as such. I see it indicative of behavior of people who don't have a lot of experience with, one, revolutions, and two, democratic government. And I think over time, with enough pressure from the opposition, both Islamist and non-Islamist opposition to Morsi's rule, I think some of these greater excesses will be wound back. But I don't think that the rise of the Islamists in Tunisia and Egypt and elsewhere is a net good for the region. I'm very worried about the impact it is going to have on individual rights, but I also understand that there are larger dynamics at play that are influencing their behavior, and it's not purely an outgrowth of their ideology. And to just view it through the lens of ideology, I think, will cause us to make some very poor policy decisions in the region.
Can I shift the topic a little bit? You laid out this set of interests: controlling terrorism, access to oil, preserving Israel's democracy. To focus on the terror issue for a minute, what, and maybe just each of you can, what is it that the U.S. could do that would diminish the risk of terrorist incidents to us, either homegrown or imported from abroad? Starting with you, Ayaan.
I think that the United States government and the United States civil society should start as soon as possible an ideological or an ideas campaign against terrorism. What we've seen since 9/11 is military, police, security, a great deal of that, but we haven't really approached, we haven't come anywhere near composing a counter message. We said, if you ask anyone from this administration or the previous administration or even the administration before that, who exactly is the enemy, you'll come up with answers like Al-Qaeda, violent extremism, fundamentalism, jihadism, etc. But even within our own borders, we don't have an agreement on what exactly the enemy is. I could help define that. And then once you define what that is, I think we should start waging an offensive in counter-propaganda, but also a message that will resonate with the people.
So who is the enemy? I mean, do they hate us, as George Bush said, because of our freedom and our Western way of life? Other people say that's complete bunk. I mean, what is the reason?
The United States of America is founded on a set of principles, on a set of ideas. Just call that set of ideas America. If you read the manuals of Al-Qaeda, of the Muslim Brotherhood, of any variety of radical Muslims, it's also based on a set of ideas. That set of ideas is political. I'm happy for now to call it political Islam. And political Islam and the idea of America are not only theoretically in opposition, but right now they're confronting one another. One group of people is waging the war every way possible, using terrorism mainly because it's the weaker power. But what they're not weaker at is getting their message across, inspiring and animating masses and masses of people across the world to adopt the ideas as peacefully as possible. The people who adhere and love the idea of America are not doing that. And so there is an asymmetry therein, and I think it's time we catch up. I think it's cheaper. I think it's more humanitarian. And I think also that the idea...
We're being taught in our own country that part of the problem is we don't have any values, you know. I mean,
yes.
I'm sorry to say, but sometimes our president is not the greatest defender of our country and our values.
And our president is a product of what 20, 30 years of education in moral relativism. And as long as that moral relativism is still strong, then America is going to be defeated by America. America is not going to be defeated by Islam. America is not going to be defeated by communism, etc. But one way we were able to defeat communism and the other ideologies of the past was because people here were confident that this idea of political freedom, the idea of economic freedom combined, that was powerful and stood in itself. So it wasn't only military operations. It wasn't only humanitarian programs. There were programs on freedom and a complex set of ideas that was sold to people across the world. It's better to adopt this versus that. And with Islam, we are failing with that.
We have to give Darin a chance here.
At least there's some Americans who...
And I think, I think I'm going to state the obvious, which is that, terrorism is a very complex problem, and it cannot be...
It's a very simple tactic.
Again, it's a complex issue, and I don't think that there's just one solution, that I can put forward that will solve the challenges that we're confronting. I would note that in addition to the continued cooperation that our government has with other governments in the region on issues such as counterterrorism, that is important. But I think we also need to remember that there need to be alternatives to those in that youth gap that we spoke about, who don't have jobs, who don't have economic opportunity. We need to ensure that there are alternatives available to them other than the messaging that they're hearing from some of these terrorist networks. So continued cooperation with the private sector, ensuring greater foreign domestic investment, the presence of greater jobs in country, working with governments to support greater support for the growth of small and medium enterprises. All of the long-term work on economic growth and investment that needs to be done to confront the youth gap, I think, will offer one piece of a solution to confront the terrorist challenge. And I do need to note that I need to stick up for our president. I think that he has been very out front in his support of the transitions in the region. I think he has been very vocal in the need to use U.S. Soft power and other forms of power to confront terrorist challenges. So I think let's not say that he's not recognizing.
Lively, I like that. Ahmed, do you have any thoughts on what we should, or anybody can do to diminish the terror threat?
As I said before, we made the revolution not for Sharia law, but for principles about social justice, dignity, and freedom, and that is our battle now in the future to achieve that demons, and we will not stop. So if anyone, American administration or anyone wants to help, so they must or he must to help to support these principles. For example, I want to mention something about Secretary Kerry when he visits Egypt. He didn't meet with revolutionary or youth movements or opposition, but he met with military, Morsi, and businessmen. So what is supporting of principles? Where is supporting of principle or the revolution? So this is for just remark about equality and constitution. It's a long-term battle. Maybe now, because the majority and organized groups like Islamists, they won the election and they made the constitution. But in the future, we will keep our struggle to change this constitution and have a real equality and real tolerance. Thank you.
Okay, Will,
All right.
on terror.
Yeah, I don't have an applause-worthy line, just a little piece of analysis. A lot of the terrorism that comes out of the Middle East is incubated in open wars. If there is a civil war of some sort, it attracts foreign fighters, it drives recruitment from abroad. Networks are set up to fund the fighters that later the networks are channeled into other regions. My suggestion, my policy recommendation it follows from that observation. If you want to make sure that there are fewer terrorists coming out of the Middle East, you have to make sure that there are fewer of these civil wars, and of course Syria being the most worrisome one. The longer it goes, the more foreign fighters are going to travel there, the more that people who are fighting there will become more radicalized, the better weapons they are going to get, the better networks they'll have, the better access to funding, and these folks are going to go somewhere else once that conflict eventually ends. So the quicker the United States and its allies can help bring that conflict to a close, the better for the terrorism problem.
Do you see Syria ultimately breaking up?
I don't think it will break up into separate countries, but I think we're looking at a situation like Lebanon in the 1980s where you have various warlords controlling different parts of the country for quite a long period of time.
And you listed Israel on the list. How much is Israel a reason for the problems we face, our support of Israel, a reason for the, quote, problems we face in the Middle East? Or would we have them if Israel didn't exist?
I think the reality is that the challenges that exist in the region, again, there are many reasons, but when we focus specifically on the uprisings that we've seen in the transition countries, those uprisings are largely tied to the historic challenges, economic challenges, as well as frustrations with governments that were not responsive to the needs of the people. And so I think that is the core reason for the transitions that we've seen in the country. And working on those core challenges, providing for economic assistance, providing for democratic reform that meets the needs of the people, will remain the focus. Our relationship with Israel will remain. They are our ally. We are have a strong relationship with Israel in the region, but we also have strong relationships with other countries in the region. And so our foreign policy will remain multifaceted and need to take all of those issues into account.
we have, what, 2 minutes? Oh, it's over, she's saying. Sorry about that. I didn't give anybody a chance to sum up, but I appreciate all of you and your candor and the audience participation.